You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is Wednesday, December 10th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. We are excited to announce that Dr. Horne's latest book, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin, will be released in the coming weeks and will be available on the International Publisher's website. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, first we want to ask you about the Trump administration's 2025 National Security Strategy. On December 4th, 2025, the Trump administration issued its 2025 National Security Strategy. Dr. Horne, what should our audience know about President Trump's 2025 National Security Strategy? And what are the implications for China, Russia, the EU, and most importantly, this hemisphere?
Well, potentially this national security strategy could be profound. It could, in fact, signal the onset of a new world order. On the other hand, it could represent just a retrenchment of U.S. imperialism. It reminds me in a sense of Vietnamization, whereby the Nixon administration particularly was trying to shift the burden of fighting the progressive forces in Southeast Asia to their cronies in that part of the world. And this national security strategy also has a whiff and an odor of that failed strategy. Recall that it was just the prelude to U.S. imperialism being booted out of Vietnam altogether in April 1975. What's interesting is that it downplays confrontation with the People's Republic of China. And you might be able to infer that China is so powerful nowadays that U.S. imperialism is reluctant to confront it frontally. Recall as well that it downplays confrontation with Russia, which has the European Union up in arms. It's infuriating Brussels, and they now see themselves, understandably, as out on a limb with Ukraine, as Mr. Trump is pulling the rug out from under them with regard to that proxy conflict. It also upends centuries of internal European conflict. Recall that going back to Peter the Great, 300 years ago, there has been a conflict on the old continent as to whether or not Russia, the most populous nation in Europe, the most richly endowed nation in Europe with gold and natural gas and oil, would inevitably play the leading role in Europe, a result that Napoleon tried to upend approximately 2 centuries ago. The Crimea War of the 1850s, whereby Britain, France, and Turkey ganged up on Russia, was also an effort to make sure that Russia stayed in its place. Then in 1905, London helped to sponsor a rising Japan's attack upon Russia. And we, of course, all know about Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 with Berlin's invasion of Russia, and of course, the Cold War, spearheaded by U.S. imperialism. But particularly the Cold War, I think, has a lot to do with this national security strategy, because even though U.S. imperialism celebrates it as a major victory, in order to effectuate that so-called victory, they had to engage in massive foreign direct investment in China to the point where the engineer of that gambit, speaking of the late President Richard M. Nixon, suggested right before he died that he might have been able to create a Frankenstein monster. And given the fact that statistics show just a few days ago that China has a trade surplus of $1 trillion, something that's extraordinary in terms of human history, suggests that Mr. Trump might be taking that nostrum by Richard M. Nixon into account. Certainly, Mr. Trump has a bone to pick with the European Union. He's made that clear. It has a larger market than that of the United States of America. You see European corporations like Airbus challenging Boeing in that profitable sector of aerospace. You see as well that right before the proclamation of this national security strategy, the European Union fined Twitter, or X, I should say, $120 million for violating its digital regulations, which called upon Mr. Elon Musk to suggest that the EU should be banned. It should be disintegrated. And of course, voila, a few days later, you see this national security strategy. I think it's also quite alarming to Europe that Mr. Trump is actually actively interfering in the internal affairs of these sovereign states. In fact, he's begun to treat the EU like the vassals that they are, but more than that, he's treating them as if they're developing countries. That is to say, pushing Germany to give more breathing space to the Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany, likewise for the right-wing forces in France under Marine Le Pen, and not to mention Nigel Farage, who is their comrade. And that has Europe up in arms, although they're so intimidated by US imperialism and Mr. Trump, and so leery and wary of being out on a limb with regard to this Ukraine proxy war, that they're reluctant to speak out. But Mr. Trump is clear that he is seeking to export Trumpism. And of course, the number one priority, he says, in this national security strategy document is this hemisphere, reviving the 2 centuries old Monroe Doctrine. Recall that that doctrine suggested that outside powers should steer clear of the Americas. That's going to be very difficult because China has been investing heavily in the neighbors of the United States of America, including a free port in the Bahamas, which has substantial Chinese investment, perhaps as much as neighboring Cuba, not to mention Jamaica, where there's been heavy involvement and heavy investment in highways and in ports. So you should also know that the Monroe Doctrine also called for the United States to stay out of European affairs. And as noted, Mr. Trump has conveniently ignored that application. I think the country that's probably in most danger is Canada, for example, not only because of its vast natural resources, including timber and water, that are desired by US imperialism, but Canada, in my estimation, is not ideologically prepared for what it is about to endure. In fact, Canada is a leading exemplar of what I call formulaic thinking. That is to say, even the left in Canada has this formula that republicanism, the system you have in the United States of America, is good, and monarchy in Canada, where King Charles of London is the head of state, is bad. But as I've tried to point out in these books on counter-revolution that are now a part of a trilogy, it would be as if saying that the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1890s was good, and its replacement by racist republicanism was also good. And of course, that is ludicrous. So if you are going to take this position that republicanism is so great and 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, which seems to be a consensus north of the border, well, then you could just say that Mr. Trump is trying to execute the final stage of the so-called revolution by taking over Canada, which is obviously absurd. It's also a threat, speaking of this national security strategy, it's a threat to Brazil. Already the son of the former leader, Bolsonaro, is threatening to run for the highest office of the land. I think the race takes place next year. And what's interesting is that Lula da Silva, the current head of state, has not necessarily played his cards properly, although I understand since up until being elected a few years ago, he was in prison, recall. But his refusal to stand adamantly by Venezuela, I think, is going to undermine some of his support on the left. And I would also say that with regard to this hemisphere, the domestic constituencies are also in hot water, although they're not mentioned in the national security strategy. I think of the Black American constituency, which fundamentally has no foreign allies. And although it's a major target of the Trump regime and the settlers in general, who are still smarting over the fact that their most valuable investment, speaking of the ancestors of Black Americans, were confiscated without compensation, that is to say, billions of dollars seized, throwing many families of settlers into poverty. Turning to Asia, that's the secondary priority behind the Americas. Obviously, Taiwan should be worried that, speaking of the island that China claims as its own, I don't think that Mr. Trump will be that eager to rush to the defense of China. So, rush to the defense of Taiwan. But once again, to conclude this particular section, we may be on the verge of a new international situation with this growing rift between Europe and the United States, with a crackdown on the neighbors of the Americas, particularly Canada, and with the domestic constituencies under fire. On the other hand, it may just be a final stage of settler colonialism, which, as you know, involved class collaboration between the elite and the middle class and the working class of the European settlers. This time, it does not appear that the latter two sectors, speaking of the middle class and the working class, will share in the bounty. Of course, many of them shared in the bounty of the expropriation of the indigenous population. Many of them became landowners. Many of them are, of course, affluent farmers, even though Mr. Trump has just authorized a $12 billion bailout. But that in turn signifies their political importance. But in some ways, in reading this document, and I recommend that our audience peruse it, it's only about 30 pages or so, it reminded me of a Hollywood film, Elysium, starring Matt Damon and Jodie Foster, which talks about, in a science fiction manner, how the 1% decided to depart this planet, which had fallen victim to the climate crisis, and move to outer space, leaving everybody else behind. Now, despite Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk developing rockets for outer space, I'm not sure if the 1% abandoning the rest of us on this planet is on offer, but they may be abandoning the rest of us for their gated communities, for their Trump towers and their Mar-a-Lago resorts. And I think, once again, as we've said repeatedly, another danger, and I see this coming down the pike as we speak, is that we'll gear up, understandably, to reject neo-fascism of Trumpism, but that will open the door for neoliberalism, Biden style, which may take on the fool's errand of confronting Russia and China simultaneously. So obviously, we have a lot of work to do if we are to somehow avoid either neoliberalism or a demented New World Order or the mother of all grifts, which, now that I think about it, is probably something Mr. Trump has in store.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about Somalia. This past week, hundreds of people took to the streets of Mogadishu to voice their outrage at U.S. President Trump's reference to Somali immigrants as garbage. Speaking at a cabinet meeting last Tuesday, December 2nd, President Trump said Somali Americans, quote, contribute nothing. We don't want them in our country, and referred to them as, quote, garbage. And under President Trump, the U.S. significantly increased airstrikes in Somalia against so-called Al-Shabaab and ISIS by easing restrictions to allow more strikes targeting these so-called militants. Yet several watchdog groups have found evidence of widespread civilian casualties from the increased strikes, raising further concerns about U.S. credibility in the region. Dr. Horne, it seems that President Trump has a particular animosity for Somalia. Why is Somalia such a target for President Trump in the U.S.? And what is the historical context that we should be aware of?
Well, Somalia, of course, is in the crosshairs because, number one, they're of African descent in a country based on anti-Blackness. They're heavily Muslim in a country where Islamophobia plays a major role. And of course, they're immigrants. I agree with, or at least they were immigrants. Most of them now in Minnesota are U.S. nationals, but at one time they were immigrants. And I agree with Congresswoman Omar, the Somali American Congresswoman from the Gopher State, where she suggests that Mr. Trump has no answer for the affordability crisis, so therefore cue the bigotry. Now, that begs the question of why Mr. Trump feels, perhaps accurately, that so many settler descendants will be taken by his bigotry. Historically, Somalia was ravaged by the slave trade, not the Atlantic slave trade, but the slave trade heading across the Red Sea to West Asia, particularly to Saudi Arabia, and northward into Cairo and Alexandria. It was colonized principally by Italians. However, a turning point came in the 1970s when, under the leadership of Siad Barre, you saw Somalia embarking on a non-capitalist path to development. But alas, they were baited into attacking neighboring Ethiopia, particularly after the downfall of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie and the coming to power of the so-called Derg, which too was seeking to embark on a non-capitalist path of development. But they were baited, speaking of the Somalis, into attacking their neighbor over a territorial dispute involving what was called the Ogaden. And that was the beginning of crisis and chaos in Somalia, to the point now where on a regular basis, the Trump regime bombs this East African nation, which in turn creates refugees, which in turn leads many of them to try to find their way to the United States of America, where they are demonized. So in other words, the United States is responsible for igniting chaos in Somalia, and in turn worsening the chaos by bombing this poor nation. One of the conclusions I arrive at is that in the United States, we desperately need a replica of the Council on African Affairs, which was driven out of business during the height of the Red Scare. It was engaged in African solidarity under the leadership of the late, great Paul Robeson. After the downfall of the CAA, the Council on African Affairs, you saw the rise of Trans-Africa, led by the attorney Randall Robinson, which played a major role during the apartheid struggle. But right now, we don't have an organization that could speak out more vigorously with regard to this attack on our fellow Africans, speaking of the Somali community. And it also puts us in a disadvantageous position in terms of coming to the defense of South Africa, which is now being singled out for attack by the Trump regime, not to mention the other giant of the continent, speaking of Nigeria, which Mr. Trump threatened to invade just a few days ago. So if there is any takeaway with regard to this current controversy involving East Africa, is that we really need to build and construct a solidarity organization with membership roles to boot in order to confront this anti-Blackness that has now been visited upon Minnesota.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about an article published in the Wall Street Journal this past Friday, December 5th, entitled, UAE's Ransom Payment for Kidnapped Prince Bolsters Al-Qaeda in Mali. According to the article, the UAE government paid some $23 million to the so-called jihadist group named Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, also known as JNIM, as ransom for a member of Dubai's royal family, whom the group took captive back in September. JNIM has undoubtedly put those funds to use in its ongoing campaign to blockade Bamako and potentially topple Mali's ruling junta. The prince in question is Sheikh Ahmed bin Maktoum Al Maktoum, who has been dubbed Dubai's dandy for his top hats and European suits. He was sent undercover to secure the Lologamkoto gold complex, which holds 75% of Mali's explored reserves. After Mali expelled Western minor barrick gold in early 2025, the UAE moved fast to fill the void. But Malian authorities were also in talks with Chinese and Russian firms, forcing Dubai to act through unofficial channels. The Sheikh's capture by an al-Qaeda-linked group seems to have triggered a crisis that exposes deep tensions between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, with the federal government furious over a freelance operation that risked the UAE's standing in Africa. And before we turn the mic over to Dr. Horne, we also wanted to add to the equation the news from this past Sunday, December 7th, that foreign militaries attacked targets in Benin to thwart the coup against the French-backed regime of President Patrice Talon, who has been holding power since 2016 by way of jailing opponents and barring challengers from contesting elections. Dr. Horne, what do you make of these events from this past Sunday in Benin, and considering the long-standing concerns we have raised about the UAE? What is your reaction and analysis to this news out of Mali?
Well, the Dubai story stinks to high heaven. The fact that coincidentally, the UAE paid a $20 million ransom to these reactionaries who call themselves Muslims, who have the government in Bamako and Mali under siege, that's too much of a coincidence, even for one who might call themselves a coincidence theorist. It also underscores, once again, the aforementioned point of why we need an organization involved on a regular and routine basis in African solidarity, because we really should be picketing the Washington, D.C. embassy of the United Arab Emirates. We should be picketing their consulates from New York to Los Angeles, because they're creating and causing havoc on the continent. We've spoken at length on previous programs about the havoc they're creating in Sudan, which is really beyond imagination. Now, with regard to Benin, formerly Dahomey, what's alarming about that particular intervention, speaking of the French-Nigerian intervention in order to foil the overthrow of the government in Benin, is this collaboration between Abuja and Paris. It's quite dangerous, to put it mildly. And I understand that Côte d'Ivoire, the satrap of France, was also involved in this diabolical scheme. Recall that a few years ago, when you had a change of regime in Niger, that there was a plan to have a similar intervention that was thwarted at the last moment by politicians in the Senate in Abuja. I should also point out that before the rise of this current government in Benin, from about 1975 to 1990, you had the People's Republic of Benin, which was socialist in orientation, pursuing a non-capitalist path of development. But alas, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it also fell victim to collapse as well. But what I take away from that historical era is that there remains progressivism in Benin. And I would like to think that the attempted change of regime in Benin this past Sunday was an attempt to somehow resuscitate and revive the best days of the People's Republic of Benin.
Horne, as we go around the Horn. In the U.S., the Pearl Harbor anniversary is observed every December 7th, marking the surprise Japanese attack in 1941 that brought the U.S. into World War II. Dr. Horne, how should we be connecting the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to a larger historical context involving Western imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy, particularly in the context of global anti-colonial movements?
Well, as noted in the 1893 book, this also implicates Hawaii. That is to say that before the so-called Republican coup d'etat of 1893, which brought into being an apartheid state, the monarchy in Hawaii was a modernizing entity. Hawaii, under the monarchy, had electricity and telephones well before many places on the US mainland. Hawaii had diplomatic legations all over the world, including in Africa, by the way, not to mention in Europe. And it also played a pivotal and instrumental role in helping to drag Japan out of feudalism into capitalism, because in some ways, the monarchy in Japan was emulating its Pacific neighbors, speaking of Hawaii. But alas, when the racist Republicans, small r, seized power in the 1890s and established an apartheid state, they also sought to bar indigenous Hawaiians and Hawaiians of Japanese ancestry from voting, which helps to stir the pot of resentment, not least in Japan itself, creating significant animosity towards the resultant regime in Honolulu. And I don't think you can understand the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941 without understanding that backstory. However, the problem is that the Japanese imperialists really were seeking to convert China into a kind of Africa, just like the Europeans and the Euro-Americans exploited Africa shamelessly in order to catapult itself and themselves into the front ranks of capitalism and imperialism. Japan was seeking to emulate that model with China and Korea as the models. And the problem today is that China is now one of the more powerful nations on planet Earth. It has not forgotten the torture it endured under Japanese occupation in the late 1930s and early 1940s, to the point where there have been headlines about an upcoming war between Japan and China, which of course would open the gates of hell. So I would urge once again that our friends in Russia, who have good relations with China, and of course good relations with India, which in turn has good relations with Japan, to get involved in some sort of mediation effort to forestall the possibility that this conflict with Japan and China could erupt into something that would be utterly dangerous.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the anniversary of the assassination of Black Panther leaders Mark Clark and Fred Hampton on December 4th, 1969. The Chicago Sun published an article on December 4th entitled Killings of Black Panthers, marked with a plaque in Chicago 56 years later. Dr. Horne, who were Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, and what is their legacy, and how is their leadership an example still of vital importance today, in 2025?
Well, it's obvious that their legacy remains sterling, and it's something that we should be emulating, particularly with regard to their building an organization, the Black Panther Party, which was important ideologically. It was this kind of halfway house between Black nationalism and the socialist project. It was destabilized not only by local red squads of the like that you saw in Chicago on December 4th, 1969, but also by the FBI and their notorious COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence program, which also sought to destabilize forces on the left, including the Communist Party. The legacy of the Black Panthers lives on. And as Fred Hampton once said, you can kill the revolutionaries, but you can't kill the revolution. And the struggle around political prisoners, the struggle in particular to free Mumia Abu-Jamal in Pennsylvania, helps to ensure that what Fred Hampton suggested some decades ago before his unfortunate assassination remains true. And of course, I should also mention the fact that there are other Panthers like Pete O'Neill, formerly of the Kansas City Panthers, who were able to escape the throes of US imperialism and has been living for decades in Tanzania, Southeast Africa. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.